Here in the US, our cities have way too many urban freeways. Just take a look at Tulsa, Oklahoma, where I'm from. The whole downtown is completely surrounded by a freeway loop known as the Interdispersal Loop, or the IDL. It completely chokes out the city, and it prevents the construction of the kind of walkable urban connectivity that most of us want. And in order to be able to move forward and build more walkable and connected cities, at some point we have to start tearing these urban freeways down. Now today, we're not talking about Oklahoma. We're gonna talk about a historic example of a US city tearing down one of their most hated urban freeways. We're gonna take a look at how they did it, why they did it, and how they're doing today. Today, we're talking about the Embarcadero Freeway in San Francisco. Now, just a couple of things before we get started. This is an adaptation of an essay I wrote for my architectural theory and criticism class, so here's my self-citation here. Secondly, I have not been to San Francisco, and I am not a historian, so I probably got some things wrong. If I did, let me know in the comments. And finally, thank you to Alex for providing some footage for me that you will see later on in the video. If you enjoy this style of video, make sure to leave a like. And I'm sorry because this is probably a very unique one, so don't expect too many more like it. But yeah, without further ado, let's go to San Francisco.
In the 1870s, San Francisco suddenly became very concerned with moving people across the San Francisco Bay. The first Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, was bringing numerous immigrants into the area. But San Francisco itself was on the opposite side of the bay from the railroad's terminus in Oakland. And so, the great city of San Francisco was suddenly fighting to maintain its prominence. In 1875, a wooden structure was hastily constructed at the end of Market Street to serve as a hub for incoming and outgoing ferries. This building was replaced in 1898 with a massive Beaux-Arts-style complex designed by A. Page Brown. The most prominent feature of this building was a 245-foot clock tower placed perfectly on axis with Market Street, which allowed for convenient streetcar connections to the rest of the city. This new state-of-the-art facility would serve both as a landmark and as an entrance to the city, and the San Francisco Ferry building would become the second largest transit hub in the world by the 1930s. The Ferry building was only a temporary solution to San Francisco's transportation woes. In 1939, ferry ridership began to decline. By 1949, all streetcar connections to the facility were removed. In 1959, the Ferry building would hit its lowest point yet, when the Embarcadero was converted to a double-decked freeway. This new highway completely obstructed the view of the Ferry building from Market Street, denying its prominence as a landmark. The highway also isolated the Ferry building from the rest of the city, completely destroying the pedestrian experience, which was once so important to the operation of the facility. Throughout the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, the Ferry building continued its existence as a funny relic of the past, split apart from the rest of the city, and was nearly forgotten. However, in 1989, all of this was about to change. Back in 1872, 3 years prior to the opening of the first ferry building, Norton I, Emperor of the United States and Protector of Mexico, declared that a suspension bridge be built from Oakland Point to Goat Island and thence to Telegraph Hill, provided such bridge can be built without injury to the navigable waters of the Bay of San Francisco. This proposal was not entirely novel. Just a few months prior, the Bay Bridge Committee had been formed to look into this very possibility. It would not be until 1933 that construction of the bridge would actually commence. The bridge, however, took shape quickly. It was completed in 1936, and passenger rail service across this bridge started in 1939. This rail link was the beginning of the end for the ferry building, cutting travel times significantly across the bay. But the Bay Bridge was not without its own problems. From the very beginning, automobiles were welcome to use the bridge as well. Within a few short years, it became clear that congestion would be a serious issue, both on and around the bridge. In 1948, a solution to the congestion was introduced. The San Francisco Trafficways Plan proposed the construction of grade-separated freeways throughout the heart of the city, allowing for easy automobile access to and from both the Bay Bridge and the famous Golden Gate Bridge. Over the next few years, many different freeways proposed in this plan had begun construction, including the Embarcadero, directly in front of the Ferry building. These new roads were providing more convenience for drivers to access locations deeper in the city, including Chinatown, which was just starting to regain its footing after being destroyed by an earthquake and fire in 1906. But the continuing expansion of these freeways met continually greater problems. By 1959, 7 of the 10 proposed freeways had already been cancelled, and it would take another 5 years before a second freeway plan was introduced. In the late 1960s, a few improvements to the Embarcadero would be constructed, including ramps at Washington and Clay Streets, but for the most part, highway expansion in the city had halted. In 1985, the Board of Supervisors voted to remove the portion of the Embarcadero freeway which had been built. It was put to a public vote the next year, where citizens ultimately decided that the Embarcadero freeway should remain. But then, as mentioned earlier, everything changed in 1989. San Francisco's Chinatown has a long and varied history, dating back to the 1850s, when Chinese prisoners fled to San Francisco in hopes of striking it rich. Many found work building the Transcontinental Railroad, and when the railroad was completed in the 1870s, these workers came drifting back into the city. Due to racist regulations such as the Chinese Exclusion Act, Chinatown was forced to thrive without the support of the rest of the city. Chinatown became a refuge, a heterotopia for a largely underprivileged and downtrodden group. For half a century, San Francisco's Chinatown grew and flourished, becoming known as a tourist destination despite its parallel reputation as a center of crime and violence. In 1906, Chinatown was leveled by an earthquake and the resulting fires. In the upcoming years, the neighborhood was rebuilt with a very intentional sense of campy Orientalism, playing into the exotic perception of the area and its residents held by outsiders. Pagoda-inspired rooftops, vibrant colors, and intricately carved dragons would come to adorn many of the new structures built in the wake of the earthquake. Tourism would soon pick back up and continue to increase throughout the 20th century. For Chinatown business owners, transportation systems which provide potential customers access to the area have always been critical. Cable cars and trolleys were constructed soon after the earthquake, so in the 1950s, just after San Francisco's big freeway plans were announced, many business owners in Chinatown were supportive. The Broadway Tunnel was constructed in 1952 as a part of that plan, which drastically improved the connection between Chinatown and surrounding neighborhoods. With the opening of the Embarcadero, Chinatown was now directly connected to Oakland and beyond. Understandably, the Embarcadero was considered an exciting development for this neighborhood. Chinatown was more connected to further corners of the metro area than ever before. Ironically, the new status quo of white flight and unchecked suburbanization, propped up by these freeways, would lead to a significant decline in Chinatown tourism in the 1970s, with many businesses closing up shop and moving elsewhere. Despite this evident decline, residents of Chinatown still held the Embarcadero in high regard. When rumors of its planned removal began circulating in the 1980s, local activist Rose Pak led an opposition effort, maintaining that Chinatown needed the Embarcadero. In 1986, her efforts paid off, and the planned demolition was blocked by a public vote. But something changed in 1989, something Chinatown had witnessed 83 years prior. A massive earthquake known as the Loma Prieta caused major structural damage to the Embarcadero. Luckily, Chinatown itself was not severely impacted by this earthquake, and there were no major fires, as had been the case in 1906. But the city now had to make a decision regarding the Embarcadero. Would the damages be repaired, or would the structure be demolished altogether? Throughout this story, a larger movement had been stewing in San Francisco, which serves as an important context to understanding this story. Beginning with the 1948 Trafficways Plan, residents realized that many of the imagined freeways would have to cut through parks, neighborhoods, businesses, and public spaces, displacing thousands of people and creating massive fractures in the otherwise dense urban fabric of the city. Overnight, the San Francisco Freeway Revolt was born, and protests began began springing up throughout the city. At first, the city board of supervisors was confused by this opposition, and they began carrying out their construction of these freeways as planned. After all, traffic congestion was significant within the city, and something had to be done to alleviate and overcome this serious problem. Clearly, the protesters were simply overreacting to change, and they would learn to appreciate these freeways once they were completed. But the protests did not let up. Within just a few years, 7 of the 10 planned freeways were canceled outright. Still determined to finish the network, the city unveiled a new freeway plan in 1964, which would lead to the largest demonstration yet. One of these new proposed freeways was to pass directly through Golden Gate Park in the adjacent Panhandle. This park was quickly occupied by protesters, who would continue gathering in the park on a regular basis throughout the 1960s. Folk singer and activist Malvina Reynolds conveyed the sentiment of these protests perfectly in her 1964 ballad, Cement Octopus. These protests were largely successful. In the late 1960s, a few improvements to the Embarcadero would be constructed, including ramps at Washington and Clay Streets, but for the most part, highway expansion in the city had halted. When the Loma Prieta earthquake hit in 1989, Mayor Art Agnos saw this as an opportunity to make a decision about freeways and their role in the city. Despite the opposition from Chinatown, the majority of the Embarcadero freeway was quickly removed, and the city could then begin to reconnect itself with the Ferry building and with the waterfront as a whole. The San Francisco freeway plans of 1948 and 1964 assumed that a system of massive interconnected freeways would provide a solution to traffic congestion within the city. What was not considered in these plans was whether or not freeways are actually an efficient and productive use of valuable urban space. The Freeway Revolts revealed that the public would not support the amount of demolition and displacement proposed by these plans, and as a result, another approach would have to be considered. Luckily for San Francisco, this dark horse solution was already underway. All the way back in 1872, just after his declaration regarding the Bay Bridge, Emperor Norton declared that a study should be conducted to explore the possibility of building a rail tunnel below the bay. In 1947, a joint team of Army and Navy engineers came to this exact same conclusion. In 1959, just after the first round of freeway cancellations, seismic studies were carried out to determine the best approach for such a project. By 1965, a year after the Golden Gate Park protests had begun, construction on the Transbay tunnel commenced. In 1969, the tunnel was completed, and the first BART trains began operating below the bay in 1974. This rapid connection across the bay drastically increased both capacity and connectivity, proving that trains could be the solution to San Francisco's congestion. Additionally, an underground rail line does not create the same sort of fracturing effect as an above-ground freeway. Significantly fewer homes and businesses would need to be displaced. But it's not all about trains. In 2019, ferry ridership in San Francisco reached its peak of 2.4 million. The removal of the Embarcadero symbolically served as a rediscovery of the ferry building, and the ferry services have begun to flourish in recent years as people have begun looking for alternative means of transit outside of cars. After the Embarcadero was demolished, Rose Pack advocated for a new Chinatown transit connection. She turned her attention to rail. And finally, in 2023, the Central Subway opened for full operation. The final station on this line is called the Chinatown Rose Pack Station. Currently, the main downfall to rail is its slow pace of development. In the same amount of time that the Transbay Tunnel was proposed, studied, planned, and constructed, much of the freeway network was already fully operational. The slow pace of construction on the Central Subway left Chinatown without a rapid transit connection for 43 years. But as the construction and demolition of the Embarcadero can teach us, the fastest and simplest solution to a particular problem can often have more disastrous unintended consequences. We should be spending the extra time, effort, and resources to ensure that quality transportation is provided without fracturing communities and erasing the identity of our cities. Today, both the Ferry building and Chinatown are considered landmarks within San Francisco, and tourism flourishes in both, not because they are quickly and easily accessible, but because they cause visitors to slow down and take in their surroundings. Trains allow fast-paced access to slow-paced living without all the stress induced by cars. Today, nobody misses the Embarcadero Freeway.
Hello again. I think the transformation in San Francisco was absolutely amazing. I totally think that more cities can follow in their lead and start removing these monstrosities from the middle of our cities. However, it's not just big cities that have this problem. Small towns are also often cut in half by a highway. Sometimes they just plow straight through their main street. And that's the case in Veneta, Oklahoma, a town which I traveled to in this video. Now, this video, we don't actually talk about removing the highway. We just talk about how the city can work with what they've got to improve the places around their main street, which just so happens to be part of Route 66. So if you enjoyed this video, I think you'll like that one as well. Make sure to check it out. Oh yeah, also thank you to my patrons. Okay, see you next time.